Whether you've just bought a new cabinet saw like this one, or you have an older model table saw, there are a few things that you can do to ensure that it delivers the performance you expect. The first part of this tune-up is a thorough review of the owner's manual. If you don't have one, you can get it from the manufacturer, or you can find one online. Now let's start with a step-by-step check and adjustment of the components of your table saw. Now before beginning any adjustments of your table saw, make sure that you unplug it. Now to make it easy for you to see what I'm doing and also to make it easier to do these adjustments, I've removed the guard, so we'll just set that to the side. Now what I want to do is talk about the flatness of the tabletop because that's important and everything starts from there. After you put your extension on, use a steel square like this to make sure that the line across here is even, that there's no light visible underneath this, which means the extension is flat and square to the tabletop. Secondly, we have the throat plate. Throat plate also has 4 adjustment screws that allow it to be leveled. Key inside each one of these and using the same square will allow you to raise and lower that throat plate, again making sure that that is even all the way across. So you've now made a perfectly nice flat tabletop. Now let's turn our attention to the table saw blade. It's important that the table saw blade be perfectly parallel with the miter slot, and it's easy to check. Take a standard combination square and a Sharpie marker and mark one of the teeth of this blade. I like to use the one that's facing in. Adjust my combination square in the slot until it just touches the tooth that I've marked. Rotate that tooth to the back and make sure that your combination square just touches again that previously marked tooth exactly the same way. When it does, you know that your blade is parallel to the miter slot. If your table saw blade does not align with the miter slot, you're going to have to make adjustments to make sure that it does. On a cabinet saw, it's the top that moves in relation to the base. To adjust table saw blade alignment, loosen the bolts at the top of the cabinet, align the top, and retighten those bolts. Now on a contractor saw, it's a little bit different. The trunnion bolts are the things that have to be adjusted, and I would suggest that you go to a manual to make sure that you know how to do that. Now in order to avoid a little frustration when you're adjusting either your cabinet saw or your table saw, loosen only 3 of those 4 bolts. That way you've got a firm pivot point to be able to move the top or the base before making your final adjustments. If you loosen all 4 of them, everything's floating and makes it really tough. Now the last adjustment to your table saw blade is making sure that it rests at both 90 and at 45 when it's at its stops correctly. I like to use a plastic square. I'll set it up against the face of the blade, make sure it doesn't touch any of the teeth, and check the alignment. This is at a 90, and now we'll crank it to 45. And again, when it reaches the stop, use the plastic angle to see whether or not that stop has been set correctly. If any adjustments are to be made to that, they're done with stops, and your owner's manual will show you where they're placed and how to make those adjustments. Now let's turn our attention to the cabinet saw fence. It, like the blade, has to be parallel to this miter slot. And we're going to check that parallel the same way we did with the blade. I've set a combination square. I'll slide the fence over until it just touches the edge of that combination square. And then check it at the back edge the same way, and you'll see the adjustment is perfect. Now if it's not, and all saws are a little bit different, you make the adjustment in this case by taking an Allen wrench and adjusting those screws in or out. When you take the fence on and off quite often, you may find that it's slowly run out of alignment. One of the ways I found that I can check for that is when I'm cutting a board. Once the board passes the front of the teeth, there should be no sound. The back of the teeth should not be making any cutting. If you find that you're getting secondary saw marks or a little wisp of dust coming up from the back, it's time to realign that fence. And one last thing, anytime you make adjustments to the fence, make sure that the reading on the cursor matches the distance between the fence and the blade. Now let's turn our attention to the miter gauge. That also can use some adjustments. The first thing I like to do is check and make sure that the miter gauge fits well in the slot and that there's no side play. On some miter gauges, it's really easy. They have adjustment screws that kind of take that up. This one actually fits pretty well. But if it didn't fit well, there is a little trick that you may want to try. Take a center punch and in a couple of places on one face only, dimple the edge of that material. It raises the outside edges and allows for a nice, tight fit in the miter gauge slot. Now that you've made adjustments to that miter bar, it's time to check the relationship between the 90-degree and 45-degree stops in your miter and make sure that they correspond to the pointers. I'll take a plastic square. I like to raise the blade as high as it'll go. It gives me a little bit more surface area. And by just touching the base of the blade, or the body of the blade and not the teeth, slide your miter gauge up and make sure that that reveal is even across the front. We'll do the same for the 45. And we'll see whether or not that lines up well. And again, in this case, the reveal is just perfect. If it's not, there are adjustment screws on the back of this gauge. Your owner's manual will show you how to make those adjustments. The last thing that I'll do to make sure that I have a perfect 90 degrees is a little bit more visual. I'll take a board, place it on the miter gauge and make the cut, and then check it with a square. It's sometimes a lot easier to see that, and as long as that line is nice and clean, I know that my miter is set up well. Well, now that you're done with your table saw tune-up, remember to install your guard and you're ready to go. I would still suggest that at least monthly, go through your owner's manual, kind of check the maintenance schedule. You'll see where the oiling and lubrication points are, and check your cursors for trueness. It's a nice idea to keep the tabletop waxed. Make sure you use a silicone-free wax when you do that, and enjoy yourself. Now go out and cut something.